Hi, Norwood families. This is Mrs. DiMarzio, and I was thinking about how in second grade we were finishing up or had just finished up our mystery unit. So we had all read a mystery together and our own mysteries, and some of us already began writing our own mysteries, some of us were getting ready to. But I found a classic mystery in one of my kids' rooms, and I thought I would read one of them for you to listen to and think about while we are home from school for a little while. This is Mr. Mallard. He's going to be my reading buddy over here. So the book that I found is called Encyclopedia Brown, Boy Detective. This is the first book in a series of Encyclopedia Brown books. There's a lot of them, so maybe you're even familiar with them. And I'm going to, the unique there's a unique feature of this mystery in that it's not one book about one mystery, but it's actually a bunch of different mysteries. So each chapter is a different mystery. You can see each one's titled The Case of. It's a different problem that Encyclopedia solves. So I'm going to read the first one because this one also introduces us to Encyclopedia Brown. And this is called The Case of Natty Nat. There's not a lot of illustrations, but I'll show you the one that there is. But make sure that you're listening. See if you can figure out this mystery before we get to the end. Mr. and Mrs. Brown had one child. They called him Leroy, and so did his teachers. Everyone else in Idaville called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or a set of books giving information, arranged alphabetically on all branches of knowledge. Leroy's head was like an encyclopedia. So boys and girls, when I was your age, I did not have Google to just type something in and look it up. And there was no Wikipedia where I could just search a topic and get information about. I had to either go to the encyclopedias in my house, which weren't that great. They were a little old. Or I would have to go to my school library or the local library and look up information in actual big books called encyclopedias. And just like we've been talking about, or in probably maybe in your class too, but in my class we've been talking about putting words in ABC order, alphabetical order. So sorting the words that start with A and then B and then C all the way down. That's how the topics are arranged in an encyclopedia. Anyway, I'll get back to reading. Leroy Brown's head was like an encyclopedia. It was filled with facts he had learned from books. He was like a complete library, walking around in sneakers. Old ladies who did crossword puzzles were always stopping him in the street to ask him questions. Just last Sunday after church, Mrs. Conway, the butcher's wife, had asked him, "What's a three-letter word for a Swiss river beginning with A?" R, Encyclopedia answered after a moment. Go that way. He always waited a moment. He wanted to be helpful, but he was afraid that people might not like him if he answered their questions too quickly and sounded too smart. His father asked him more questions than anyone else. Mr. Brown was the chief of police in Idaville. The town had 4 banks, 3 movie theaters, and a little league. It had the usual number of gasoline stations, churches, schools, stores, and comfortable houses on shady streets. It even had a mansion or two and some dingy sections. It had the average number of crimes for a community of its size. Idaville, however, only looked like a usual American town. It was really most unusual. For nearly a whole year, no criminal had escaped arrest and no boy or girl had gotten away with breaking a single law in Idaville. That was partly because the town's policemen were clever and brave, but mostly it was because Chief Brown was Encyclopedia's father. His hardest cases were solved by Encyclopedia during dinner in the Browns' red brick home on Rover Avenue. Everyone in the state thought that Idaville had about the smartest policeman in the world. Of course, nobody knew a boy was the mastermind behind the town's police force. You wouldn't get it by looking at Encyclopedia. He looked like almost any fifth-grade boy and acted like one too, except that he never talked about himself. Mr. Brown never said a word about the advice his son gave him. Who would believe that his best detective was only 10 years old? This is how it began. One evening at dinner, Mr. Brown said, "Natty Nat has struck again. He has held up another store, and right here in Idaville." "What store?" asked Encyclopedia. "The men's shop, owned by Mr. Dillon and Mr. Jones," answered Mr. Brown. "That makes 6 stores Natty Nat has held up in the state this month." "Are you sure the robber was Natty Nat?" asked Encyclopedia. "Mr. Dillon himself said it was Natty Nat," replied Mr. Brown. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and put it beside his plate. "I wrote down everything Mr. Dillon told me about the holdup. I'll read it to you." Encyclopedia closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he was getting ready to think hard. His father began to read what Mr. Dillon, the storekeeper, had told him about the holdup. "I was alone in the store. I did not know anyone had come in. Suddenly a man's voice told me to raise my hands. I looked up then. I was face to face with the man the newspapers called Natty Nat. He had on a gray coat with a belt in the back, just as the newspapers said. He told me to turn and face the wall. Since he had a gun, I did as he said. When I turned around again, he was gone with all the money." Chief Brown finished reading and closed his notebook. Encyclopedia asked only one question. Did the newspapers ever print a picture of Natty Nat? There's his question. "No," answered his father. "He never stands still long enough for a picture to be taken. Remember, he's never been caught. But every policeman in the state knows he always wears that gray coat with the belt in the back." "Nobody even knows his real name," said Encyclopedia half to himself. "Natty Nat is just what the newspapers call him." Suddenly he opened his eyes. "Say, the only reason Mr. Dillon thought it was Natty Nat was because of that gray coat," he said. "The case is solved." "There's nothing to solve," objected Chief Brown. "There is no mystery. Mr. Dillon was robbed. The holdup man was the same one who had been robbing other stores in the state." "Not quite," said Encyclopedia. "There was no holdup at the men's shop." "What do you mean?" exclaimed Mr. Brown. "I mean Mr. Dillon wasn't robbed, Dad. He lied from beginning to end," answered Encyclopedia. Why should Mr. Dillon lie?" demanded his father. "I guess he spent the money. He didn't want his partner, Mr. Jones, to know it was missing," said Encyclopedia. "So Mr. Dillon said he was robbed." "Leroy," said his mother, "please explain what you're saying." "It's simple, Mom," said Encyclopedia. "Mr. Dillon read all about Natty Nat in the newspapers, so he knew Natty Nat always wore a gray coat with a belt in the back when he held up stores." "Go on, Leroy," said Mr. Brown, leaning forward. Put the family at the dinner table. There's Leroy thinking. Mr. Dillon knew it would sound much better if he could blame his holdup on someone people have read about, said Encyclopedia. He said he knew it was Natty Nat because of the coat he wore. "That could be true," Chief Brown said. "That couldn't be true," said Encyclopedia. "Mr. Dillon never saw the back of the man who held him up. He said so himself, remember?" Chief Brown frowned. He picked up his notebook again. He read to himself a while. Then he fairly shouted, "Leroy, I believe you are right." Encyclopedia said, "Mr. Dillon only saw the front of the holdup man. He had no way of knowing that the man's coat had a belt in the back." "He stole money from his own store and his partner too," cried Chief Brown. and he nearly got away with it. He rushed from the dining room. "Leroy," said Mr. Brown, "did you get this idea from a television program?" Sorry, Mrs. Brown. "No," said Encyclopedia. "I got it from a book I read about a great detective and his methods of observation." "Well," said his mother proudly, "this proves how important it is to listen carefully and watch closely to train your memory. Perhaps you will be a detective when you grow up." "Mom," said Encyclopedia, "could I have another piece of pie?" Mrs. Brown sighed. She had taught English in the Idaville High School before she got married. "You may have another piece of pie," she said. And that's the end of that case. Case solved. Did you figure that out? Were you able to hear the clue and think? I didn't the first time I read it. And the second time I read it, I noticed the clue. So that means that the next time I read an encyclopedia story, I'm going to really make sure I pay attention to everything that's going on. And I'm going to see if I can figure it out next time. I hope you enjoyed this story. Maybe I'll come back and read another one. All right. Bye.